My name is Jimena Murillo, and I'm here again with Bob Reed of Edge Philanthropy. Bob is a scholar and a practitioner of philanthropy. Today, our topic is going to be the Edge Philanthropy model on how family foundations develop. Thank you, Bob, and welcome. Bob, Edge Philanthropy has developed a model intended to help families understand where they are in their development. Why did Edge develop this model?
Jimena, it's because this is a really new field. Over 70% of the foundations that exist today in the United States have existed for 15 or fewer years. What other industry do you know where that's the case? Further, economists tell us that the economic footprint of private foundations in particular, of which family foundations are the majority, are set to explode over the coming decades because of an unprecedented intergenerational transfer of wealth, a good portion of which will actually be committed to charitable purpose. Some of the latest estimates of the size of that intergenerational transition are as high as $70 trillion. Think about that. Right now, today, all foundations in the US have about collectively $1 trillion in assets. Most people believe that the portion of that $70 trillion transfer of wealth that will go to charitable purpose through instruments like private foundations will probably be somewhere between $20 and $30 trillion. So that means the footprint of family philanthropy is going to grow by 20 to 30 times.
Wow.
With a rapidly growing sector like this, we're going to need increasingly more tools that will help families to understand how they're developing and what their course looks like.
Bob, but where did the model come from?
So the model is a very intensely practical instrument. We'll go over a part of it, which is just a very high-level summary. There's a much more detailed development of the model itself that we can make available to family foundations who reach out to us. But it's based upon our research on family philanthropy and almost 28 years of experience in family foundations.
Excellent. But let's talk about the model. Let's jump into the model. Can you please describe it?
Sure, you bet. Let's try to keep things simple today, okay? I'm just going to provide a cursory review for purposes already mentioned. And this much more detailed model is available for anybody who wants it. As you know, this is a free resource, these videos and all of the other resources that we provide under the resource tab of the Edge Philanthropy website. They're intended to be helpful to foundations and foundation practitioners, families in philanthropy. But we see them basically, that this model is having three distinct stages. They're not always linear, but we're going to present them in somewhat of a linear fashion that's connected. And those three phases are getting started, learning and doing, and reconnecting to the why of family giving. So let's talk about those for a moment. Those are really simple terms, but they actually have a lot of granularity to them. So the getting started, the reason why foundations are created. I spent a little bit of time in some research that I did in 2014 and 15, looking at why foundations are created and testing a variety of ideas. We're not going to go into that right now. But ultimately, that research determined that altruism was the biggest reason for moving forward with creating a family foundation. Families wanted to have an opportunity to contribute to the well-being of others, to make a better world. And so this is about, number one, first being inspired. The idea that we can do something exciting, that we have these newfound resources that we can put to charitable purpose and really do something special. And then second of all, about aspiration. So when I say aspiration, I'm not talking about intaking a breath here. I'm talking about, what do we want to accomplish? What do we think is doable? And this is an area where family foundations tend to reach very far, sometimes way beyond their resources, because they have this really strong appetite for making a difference. So the getting started part, if it's done right, is really defining the source of inspiration and the aspiration. Why are we here? And what are we going to do? How do we know that we've done that? The learning and doing part is not nearly as much fun, but it's just as important. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we put all the mechanical pieces of a foundation together, how legally, accounting-wise, in terms of all the regulations that exist for foundations, how are all of those put in place into an operation that allows a foundation to perform in a way that's consistent with how it's created on the IRS code. Philanthropy is not a science, it's an art. There are a number of people out there, many of my colleagues who are scholars in the field, I think in some ways have tried to reduce philanthropy at some level to a science. And I take nothing away from them in that regard, because if we can improve practice, why wouldn't we? And that's the object of much of the research that we've participated in and that you have been a part of. However, the magic of philanthropy is actually in the art, not the science. It's how we imagine, because when we do things from an evidence-based approach, for example, what are we doing? We're looking in the rearview mirror based on data of prior activities. That's not where innovation dwells. Innovation dwells in looking out the front windshield of where you're heading and imagining what's down the road and what might be possible. That's where foundations have real magic. And sometimes that magic gets bogged down in some of the mechanical details. And so foundations need to be constant learning organizations, drawing lessons from everything that they're doing, and can constantly come back and ask, why are we doing this? And what did we want to accomplish? Because we have to be constantly grounded in that. Then the third phase is this idea of reconnecting to why. This is what we call the reward zone. You know, when you get into all the mechanics in that second phase, philanthropy sometimes doesn't feel a lot like fun. It feels tedious. It sometimes feels overwhelming. The object of giving money away well is very difficult. And what families tell me on a regular basis is, as difficult as it was to create the wealth in the first place, that was a lot easier for them than finding ways to deploy that wealth in impactful ways. So, as learning organizations, remembering that they are constantly learning and perfecting what they're doing, then when they come back into the why reward zone, that's where they get regrounded in how do we connect ourselves to this work. And this is where, for family foundations in particular, it's really important to break down the transactional nature of philanthropy into a more kinetic, experiential connection. And this is where very often families will go out on site visits. They'll connect with grantees. They'll sit down in blue jeans and have a Coke or a meal, break bread with a grantee. Maybe go see the work and see how the beneficiaries are interacting with the grantees and seeing the lives that are actually being changed, because that is what motivates them to stay connected. And if they don't take from the reward zone and reconnect back to starting all over again, from the very first phase. This is a progressive effort. If they don't do that, what happens is very often family foundations bog down. And when they bog down, that's when the intergenerational connection begins to wane. And if that happens, we see so many family foundations turn into sunset organizations where they spend down all of their resources and go out of existence, which is a shame. Or with worse, they are taken over and run and governed by non-family members who no longer have the passion of the family that created those to begin with. So we really believe this model is a continuous cycle. It's much more continuous cycle than a linear process. Families move in and out of these different phases in different ways, but I think it's really helpful to families to have a model. This gets to your question originally, to have a model to say, where are we in this development cycle? And constantly think about redeveloping themselves, reimagining themselves, reinventing who they are, going back to what excited us and what did we think we could do? And what excites us today? And what do we think we can do today? Really, failure in family philanthropy has to have two variables. The obvious one is failing to achieve the desired outcome. The second one has to also exist for it to be a failure, and that is that nothing was learned from the experience. You and I have talked often about a saying that I created in the 70s. If you don't learn the lesson from the experience, you will re-experience the lesson. So if you are a constant learning organization and you reposition yourself in the development, realizing that the development that you did in the 70s is probably not valid anymore in the 90s. And if that happened in the 90s is probably not valid today in the 2020s. These are living, breathing organisms, which are the manifestation of families, which are constantly evolving and changing. And this model is intended to help family foundations figure out where they are in that process.
I love the fact that this model is based on the idea that philanthropy is art instead of science. Thank you so much, Bob. As always, we learn so much from your experiences and knowledge. And again, for all of you, I've been here today with Bob Reed of Edge Philanthropy. This interview is part of a series of videos intended to offer families with a free resource. Please feel free to reach out if we can be of further assistance, and please consult the resource section of our website for select publications and videos, www.edgephilanthropy.com. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Jimena.